Sterling Bartlett is an illustrator with decades of experience, ranging from fine art to apparel and album design. Recently, his focus has shifted towards comic books. How Did We Get Here is his first entry in that medium. The book takes the form of postmodern hellfire sermon delivered by a paraphysical ultra-terrestrial entity named Void, and is available through First to Knock. Sterling, is it difficult? Is it difficult to make a comic book?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm excited to join you for a chat. It's extremely difficult to make a comic book. I have, as you said, done everything from apparel design and album design to fine art. This is absolutely the most labor-intensive artistic endeavor I've attempted. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, it's strange. I suppose this is kind of a movement that's been happening in art since sort of pop art, basically. But it's weird how these, and I'm going to use this inverted commas, like lower art forms are still kind of generally looked down upon, even though it's more than just the actual artwork itself, the illustrations itself. There's more that goes into it in terms of, you know, people are like, oh, you have to write it as well. But then, you know, there's printing and fonts and all these sorts of things. And then there's the compilation of the actual material itself. It's almost like an art form that's got several different separate art forms contained within it.
Absolutely correct. You know, when I started thinking about shifting focus from fine art more to the comic book medium, the first thing that struck me was that you not only have to have a mastery of illustration, you have to be able to write with some proficiency, you have to be an editor, you have to be a colorist, you have to understand print layout. Then there's the various sort of editing processes that you go through with collaborators or publishers in this case. It's a real endeavor. It's a I mean, I hate to sound pretentious this early in the podcast, but it's like a Gesamtkunstwerk. Like it's a totalizing work because you have to use so many channels to create it.
Yeah, so obviously it's a really, really good, like, well put together piece of work. The illustrations are fantastic. You know, it's funny, tongue in cheek in a good way. Lots of interesting visual references to things which, you know, you kind of think that, oh, I've seen that in a meme or I've seen that somewhere, and then you kind of have to look at it for a while, and then you realize that there's actually, it's hidden, lots of hidden references in there. But you know, it's called How Did We Get Here, and you know, it's got a very sort of obvious sort of critical postmodern bent to it. But how do we get out of here?
Right. That's been the question that's come up from most readers with some critical thinking faculty. And if I have an answer at all, it's humor, community, and a sense of humor and community is how we get out of here.
Right. It's interesting that as well, because especially community, at least, because, you know, it's funny because the guy on the cover looks vaguely like Jordan Peterson, I'd say, in a slightly more disheveled than he would normally dress. But there's obviously, you know, Marie Kondo and him come up as sort of targets of the humor of the comic book as well. And it's interesting you mentioned community, because although I think a lot of people can see the positives in what those sorts of people affirm, they are very sort of individualistic thinkers, aren't they?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a brief section in the book. It's broken down into sort of like micro chapters of targets of how I see us getting here. And one of the targets, or one of the chapters, is about disruptors. And Kondo and Peterson are both name checked in that chapter. The impetus for a disruptor to give you a prepackaged way out is generally egocentric. It's generally, I have the answer, I'm showing you the way, if you only pay the $19.95 for my 3-course video or my book, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not community that I'm talking about. That's a fan base or a customer base that those people are searching for. When I talk about community, I think I'm in part talking about what we're doing right now. You and I have never met. We're having an open discussion across the Atlantic Ocean. And hopefully the people that are listening along have things to say and think in new directions because of what we talk about. In the broadest way, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about community.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like this sense of community isn't something, like you say, it's not something that can be purchased as a course or whatever, right? It's different from that. And it feels like, I think the title you gave these people of disruptors was really good, because you have a lot of people who call themselves edgy or whatever, but they're at the core they're anything but it, right? They're just kind of selling a product, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And we've gotten to a point where these people a couple of years ago might have seen like people who are going to bring us out of all the craziness, but it seems like we now just have two equally crazy camps screaming at each other, pretending that they're the radicals, right?
Exactly. I think in not exactly exclusively online circles, but stemming from certain online circles, you can't have a political take at this point unless it is beyond the edge of the left or the right of the Overton window. Mm-hmm. It's almost an inversion of the Overton window, whereby only the political extremes actually have purchase and can take hold.
Right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's almost like the Overton windows become like inverted in a way, right? Like, because
exactly.
no one's going to listen to any sort of reasonable take, I don't think, these days. Anyway.
Right.
So yeah, I'm interested, because just kind of rewinding back into what you do is, you've done finer arts and these sorts of things in the past, and you've moved to this different medium. Is there kind of like one piece of work that influenced you, or one situation you're in which made you sort of go, oh, I'm actually going to change the medium I'm working in?
Well, it was a slow march over time. You talk about like a political Overton window and what is acceptable discourse. And I found in a 20-ish year career attempting to work in the fine arts in gallery systems, that my personal politics were rarely in line with the sort of systems I was working in. And in some cases, I was actually in increasingly more cases toward the last few years, I was asked to donate money to organizations through artworks, or participate in art events, be they like art fairs or gallery shows or whatever, that had this political bent to them that I was not only like not on board with, but I actually actively disagreed with. I found myself, donating like 25 or 50% of a sale to X or Y NGO or a political campaign. And eventually I realized that I was acting as a pawn against my own interests by continuing to work within this very like specific band of gallery shows or art fairs, etc. So I decided to decouple from that, and that's where How Did We Get Here initially sparked, because I wanted to write an art book about the art world, an anti-art book. And the more I wrote, the more I realized that I had a sort of long forgotten love for the form of comic books. I was an avid comic book collector up until I was about 13 or 14. I obsessed over Image Comics and specific illustrators, and that all kind of fell to the wayside through different cultural interests and, finally college. But it became very obvious to me that that's the direction I should be taking this, instead of making it a sort of a proper hardbound art book. And after about, I don't know, 10 pages of illustration work for this book, I realized, like, this is what I want to do with my creative output for the foreseeable future.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really interesting. That didn't occur to me, that what are considered sort of finer forms of art, right, are at this point probably inextricably linked with the sorts of organizations you might have an issue with, right? And
Exactly.
those percentages of donations from proceeds and all this, they're sort of implied and given and tacitly forced, right?
Tacitly enforced, because it's a quid pro quo. You can't be included in these group shows and get eyeballs on your work unless you agree to, donate to X or Y cause. And, it happens once, fine. It happens a few times, okay. When you realize that you're only being asked to be in these donation-driven group shows, you are the driver to keep these brick and mortar spaces alive. You are the driver to, manufacture consent for a political system that you don't agree with. So I'll make comic books instead. Thanks very much.
Right. And it's interesting because I think that the corruption that's present in the art world has been made quite obvious by the fact that it's now come into the crypto space. Obviously, NFTs, like, I wouldn't even argue they're having a moment now. I think the moment's probably passed, to be honest with you.
Right.
But I think a lot of the capital that's moving around within that market is of the same nature as the massive amounts of capital which move around in the art market. I have no reason to suspect why it wouldn't be. I think that sort of corrupt movement of capital is actually made easier by the whole crypto system. But I'm not sure what you think about NFTs, or if you thought about them at all.
Certainly have. Yeah, I've had a number of offers to create NFTs. I actually got pretty far along with one. For numerous reasons, it didn't work out. I was kind of trying to subvert the form of the NFT, and that's not what those things are for. They're for making, as many different kinds of various monkeys as you can, and selling them and trading them like so many baseball cards. But what do I think of NFTs? I think they're a perfect crystalline money laundering scheme. You don't have to store your goods anywhere because they're not real. You can buy as many as you want and ostensibly sell them later. I don't have great faith in that form. It doesn't mean people aren't making very real money off of them, and doesn't mean certain very specific artists aren't profiting, but it's not for me.
Right. I think that's the main thing, is the laundering aspect, because I mean, like, you've got some dirty crypto lying around, right? And that's the main issue with crypto, is how to, if you've got it in a dirty form, it's how to launder it, right? And I guess you can put an NFT out and then, send yourself the proceeds and then be like, oh, some random person sent me this much for a monkey or whatever. And then, you've gotten it out there. But
That's pretty perfect.
I don't know. Can you talk about that project? How are you trying to subvert the form? Like, can you talk about that, or is it not really something you can talk about?
I really can't. I'm NDA'd on it, and
Oh, fair enough.
it was a project that was dead in the water because it was in the Vegas terms. It wasn't illustrative in nature enough to be visually arresting. However, I am very proud of the concept, and I'd be happy to discuss it with you off record.
Right. Sure. Okay. Yeah. So we sort of spoke about how you'd like to be introduced, and you wanted to be called illustrator and not an artist. Like, what's your thinking behind that?
Well, going back to me decoupling from gallery systems and art fairs, et cetera, my bread and butter, the way I earn a living, is as an illustrator, as a commercial illustrator. I work for apparel, and as you mentioned in the intro, album design occasionally. I do a lot of work for licensed merchandise or touring bands. So that in a very real, like material sense, is how I earn my living. So I'll call myself an illustrator. The sort of not wanting to be called an artist is just an extension of me trying to divorce myself from the systems I was mentioning earlier.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what would you say your main artistic influences are? Are there any particular movement that you'd say influenced you, or artists specifically?
Absolutely. A wide range. When I was very young, I was influenced by process art. I was influenced a lot by um, illustrative yet concept heavy work. A lot of the West Coast stuff that was happening in the '60s. Like I'm really a huge fan of what they call the cool school. Um, I like Ed Ruscha. I was very influenced by Baldessari early on, which is in a lot of ways, he was making comic books. A lot of that is text and image and the interplay between those two things. From the world of comic books, like I said earlier, Image at the brand from the early '90s was a huge influence. Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, those guys. When I was a 12-year-old, I would trace and then redraw their illustrations time and time again.
Mm.
Hockney. I really have a soft spot for painting. I love the idea of painting. It's just not what I'm focused on at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, my influences are all over the place. Jim Phillips, skateboard art, that sort of thing.
Yeah, but it sounds like a very that very American strain of art, which is the sort of influenced by the commercial surroundings in a way.
Absolutely. I mean, like I said, I earn a living as a commercial artist, and I think all that was in the back of my head since an extremely young age. I liked pop art for a little while, but there's like a snide kind of resignation to commercialism in pop art that I would rather just be in the commercial world rather than comment on it constantly, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So yeah, conversely, sort of what sort of art don't you like?
Well, that's tough. I mean, what don't I like?
Or is there a specific artist or specific piece which really winds you up?
Well, in the book, I talk about the art world, and I have 3 examples of the art world not being a haven for beauty. And I am sort of like an old head, like an old kind of like a conservative as far as like what art should be, because I do have an eye for beauty and an appreciation for beauty. So in the book, I rip on Andres Serrano's Piss Christ.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Jordan Wolfson piece.
Yeah, these are examples of some of the references. I was kind of like, oh, is that a reference to this? And I had to look it up and then realize.
Yeah, exactly. And then the third, I'm blanking on their name right now. I think they're a Dutch collective that made these huge sculptures of just like dog shit that were 20 foot high on these Persian rugs. And I use those 3 examples as the art world sort of exalting sort of a disgusting underbelly. And while that absolutely has a place, it's kind of taken hold and it's become what art is. And as an illustrator and as someone who makes painstaking efforts to create like things of visual interest, I just don't want to see that held at the forefront of what art can be, I think. And maybe that's a function of age, but I don't know. I'm kind of into Cezanne right now. I just want to see some nice fruit. And I recently went through the Getty Villa and looked at Roman antiquity sculpture, that sort of thing. That's kind of where my head's at lately.
Right. I think as someone who's not an artist, I do think it bodes badly for the current state of aesthetics when I mean, I think that the common person, if you like ask someone, random person from the zeitgeist about their thoughts, they would probably give you some account of subjectivism. But I think
Right.
within the art world itself, the aim has sort of switched from beauty or aesthetically interesting to shock value. I wouldn't even say it's subjective. I would say like the goal seems to be maximum shock value.
Yeah, it goes back to the inverted Overton window we discussed. When your artistic project is sublimated or secondary to a political project, you're no longer making art. Essentially, it's simply artifice.
Yeah, and this is what's always really confused me about propagandas, like ideological pieces of artwork, because you see, even in the most ideological work, if you've got a good artist doing it, you can sort of see a glimmer of the aesthetic skill shining through. And you get this a lot with the very, like, you know, totalitarian countries like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. There's a lot of beauty in their architecture, for example, but it's got that weird sort of dangerous association with the things that come along with it as well.
Right, and in the current state of the intrinsic like tie between art and politics, beauty becomes fascistic, right? You know, any association with a sort of grace or power that shines through the aesthetic is intrinsically tied, I think, in their minds to a fascistic impulse, which I can't even begin to parse, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is strange because that position, like, it's crazy that you're like, well, I'm kind of a conservative because I think there's actually beauty. Is like blows my mind, kind of. But I'm always surprised about like, you know, you're thinking like, oh, where is the zeitgeist going to go in a year from now? And you're always surprised how much further it goes than you thought. I'm not like, what is next for aesthetics from where we are? Like, where are we going to go?
I mean, I definitely know some sort of outsider illustrator artists who are sort of making waves. If I had to guess, I would think in illustration and package design and that sort of thing, at least, you're going to see like a lot of collaging, a lot of like high-low, like rusty, crappy JPEG artifact images next to pencil drawings, next to sort of vaporwave aesthetic filtered through like a million digital systems, all kind of hodgepodge together. That's a thing I'm seeing. I kind of like it because although it's cacophonous and high and low, it at least looks new, you know, like that's interesting to me. Like that's another strain of aesthetics that like sort of runs counter to me talking about like Roman antiquity or whatever. Like if you're going to make something, even if it's a little bit ugly, as long as it looks new to me, as long as it looks like it has an eye toward the future, like I'll give it, you know, some time. I'll pay attention to that.
Yeah, yeah. But it's strange though, because I think I know what you're talking about, but I would counter that with saying it feels like for the last 20 years or so, because the vaporwave stuff comes out of that sort of 80s aesthetic, right? And
Yeah.
these sort of JPEGy artifacts things, they come out, that's kind of like late 90s 2000s culture. It doesn't feel, apart from the sort of maybe flat design, I can't think of anything new in the last 20 years. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's fair. Even the sort of quote unquote new aesthetic I'm describing is a compilation of extant sort of like aesthetic frameworks. It's just like a new contextualization maybe or whatever. But you're right. Flat design specifically is a bit of a culmination of, you know, this kind of end of history idea. That we're not going to get anything new, so let's just homogenize. Let's flatten everything, almost like a tabula rasa, so that we can start again. You know, Chick-fil-A and Scotch 3M tape and the label on your vitamins all look identical now. And I think that is the end of this, you know, 20-year arc you're describing of sameness.
Mhm, mhm.
It's the logical conclusion to that.
Yeah, it's interesting because that art style, I think it comes from the tech companies originally, but you're right, it does seem to be leaking into consumer products. But that's something I've noticed with the big tech companies is, every time they redesign their logos, they look more and more alike, I think.
Yeah, I don't know that that's consciously by design, but like I say, I think that is the moment in 20 years hence, we'll look back and see like, oh, well, all the ideas kind of ran out. We talked off at black flat design on white substrate. And then from there, we had to go somewhere. So then X or Y movement emerges from that. I don't know what that is yet, but
Right, but that's a hopeful outlook, at least, is that everything's going to become so dawdy and homogenized that it's going to necessarily lead to a new movement.
I hope so. I live very near a high street, like a big kind of shopping and restaurant street. And I've lived in this neighborhood on and off for several years, and I've seen it go through its various waves, call it gentrification, whatever you want. Uh, and even the signs on the street now are all homogenized, all sans serif, all flat design. Um, so I even see this in lived 3D space now.
Right, right. Yeah, I don't know. It sort of begs the question, just to rewind a little bit. Like, what is your opinion on this? Is getting a little bit philosophical, but like, what is aesthetics? What is beauty to you? Because there's obviously the obvious spectrum of, one side you've got, no, beauty is like an absolute thing, like a property that something has, and the other side is that, well, it either is like completely relative and subjective on the agent, or it actually doesn't exist as a property at all. Because like you said, you consider yourself kind of an artistic conservative who, because you believe in beauty in some form. What is that to you?
Um, I think beauty is the singular expression of point of view. So when we talk about flat design and flatness and sameness and homogeneity, I'm talking about a dearth of beauty because I'm talking about a dearth of difference. In a way, beauty is difference expressed through point of view. Beauty can be argumentative visually. In a lived space like a main street, I want a visual cacophony. When you think of places like Times Square, even for how sort of consumer driven and banal it is visually cacophonous, and that makes for an interesting lived experience. Now, when Times Square gets rid of all the neon and the LED signs, and they all shift to flat black on white substrate, it will only serve to look like they live.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting perspective I haven't heard before. Is that specific account of difference? Um, One interesting position I've heard before, and this is something that I don't know if you know about the philosopher Roger Scruton. He writes in his book on beauty, on aesthetics. He writes that it's when you have something magnificent. The example he gives is St. Paul's Cathedral in London. When you have something magnificent like that, right? It's not necessarily the magnificent object itself which makes it something that stands out, but it's almost the contrast with the surroundings. And he uses that as an example because London, especially in the last 50 years, has well, quite fast if you think about it, sort of moved from a fairly bombed out city, to be honest with you,
Right.
to just like any other European capital, which has these monuments of steel and glass, which all look pretty similar, but have strange angles which make them look different, but also kind of tower over the cathedral. And it sort of, makes St. Paul's look less extravagant. You look at footage from the 50s and it's like even the Tower of London, which looks really minuscule now, looks more magnificent because of its surroundings, which complement it.
Mm.
And it's interesting because I feel like when you have, maybe you disagree with this, but you see those images online of people will say, like, you know, the capitalist hellscape or whatever, but it's basically just a highway with a McDonald's on one side and a Taco Bell on the other side. You've got all this sort of stuff. And when you say a cacophony, that's, when I think of a cacophony, that's almost what my mind jumped to. But it's interesting how you can, because I can imagine it, right? You can imagine a cacophony which is aesthetically pleasing and one that isn't aesthetically pleasing. And I'm just wondering what you think the difference between those might be.
So I'll speak alongside this. Like my girlfriend and I, when we moved in together a few years ago, had very different sort of like visual ideas of how to decorate our home. I'm really interested in sort of mid-century modern and previous sleek pieces of furniture, but like lots of tchotchkes and things everywhere. And she was more interested in more like opulent furniture and maybe like lots of books. Like we built a library in the house and stuff. And at first blush, you would think those wouldn't go together. But this is the kind of cacophony I'm talking about that is, in this specific case, literally born of community, of two people. You make these intersections work in a way that becomes more visually pleasing through the intermingling of them. And I think we've done okay. It feels really like warm and homey. If you look at like an IKEA showroom, right? There's always the sort of perfect amount of sort of fun-loving little items delicately placed on a shelf, never too many books. You know, it has to be a lot of open white space. At a certain point, these kind of lived spaces feel clinical. And if we can work together to make things feel unclinical and warm, I think we're approaching something there.
IKEA is a very interesting example because IKEA has a problem, right? When you go into an IKEA, it could be quite difficult or time consuming to actually get out.
Yeah.
And I feel like if IKEA as a space was actually homely and inviting, they'd have the opposite problem.
Absolutely. People wouldn't want to leave.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it feels like what you're talking about in terms of, you say kind of cacophony, but I think it's got more to do with what you were originally saying about community, because it feels like as long as a space is lived in and used, it sort of escapes that base sort of off-putting materialism. Maybe a good example, I don't know, is kind of, you know, like you said, you can have a retail community which is a cacophony and, you know, is like a kind of a mess of different styles and different, like, you know, different outlets which have very different looks. But as long as it's a living, breathing space, it's got some sort of life to it. And it's weird how that, and I guess it's just because we're living creatures, right? It gives it sort of that aesthetic feeling to it. The converse of that, if you've ever seen these sort of, you know, like abandoned mall spaces.
Oh yeah.
That's kind of like what the same space looks like when you take the life out of it.
Yeah, another perfect example, in my opinion, would be the shift in coffee shops over the last 20 years, at least in America. Like we used to have these spaces that were kind of made to look like English gentlemen's clubs or something, big overstuffed chairs, dark green walls. There were books everywhere. I remember going to coffee shops in the 90s when I was younger as a teenager and just thinking that these places were sort of amazingly homey. And over the ensuing decades, what's happened is they've become clean, tile floors, simple, spindly furniture, because they don't really want you there that long. They want to turn and burn these spaces and sell as many cups of joe and croissants or whatever is possible. So you end up inhabiting a space that was initially what they used to call like a third place. Like it's not home, it's not work, it's this medium zone where you can exist. In Southern Europe, it'd be like the men sitting outside, like having espresso, just talking shit all day. That doesn't exist in a world where every minute has to be monetized and capitalized on. So you end up having a coffee shop that looks much more like your doctor's waiting room, because functionally it's the same thing at this point.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and it comes along with sort of the proliferation of, I think, you know, it's the small things which add up. Like, for example, you know, you introduce LED lights, which are very similar to fluorescent lights in terms of the, you know, effect they have on the ambience of the space. For some reason, when people are remodeling, they assume that they need to have that sort of tiled floor or a certain type of furniture, which usually doesn't last very long. But it's those little things which add up. Like, for example, if you switch from a soft carpeted floor to a tiled or wooden floor, you immediately change the acoustics of the space.
Totally.
And it sounds like a small thing, but it completely changes like the way we react to the space.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you know, our lived spaces used to be in service of us, and I think that flipped at some point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's strange because it feels like if again, getting a bit like conspiracy theory, but it sounds like feels like a very top down thing, because I don't know whose decision it was to suddenly just have like tiled and wood floors in trade magazines and not do carpets anymore. Like, I don't know whose decision this was.
Yeah.
And it all seems to be going in one direction. Like, for example, you know, if you have to wear a mask going into a coffee shop, all of a sudden you've made it, you know, even more uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
And you know, we've got certain situations, some countries over in Europe, where, you know, you have to show your your papers to get into a coffee shop, and
Yeah.
it's really destroyed those spaces. And like you said, going back to community, it's got this atomizing effect. And I don't know how we turn the tide on that one, but it'd be good to see it go in the opposite direction, maybe.
Well, the biomedical stuff you're talking about has really driven a stake in not only the community aspect of spaces, but this even further made these spaces less inhabitable. I live in Los Angeles, California, a place where we do have to show papers to go get a beer, a coffee, pizza, you know, whatever. There are minimum wage workers, bussers at restaurants, and doormen at bars that are routinely inquiring about my medical status so that I can buy a six-pack of beer, or I can go get a sandwich somewhere, which A, you're right, that destroys the community aspect completely. But B, there is now a kind of a bulwark at the front of these spaces. There's either a podium, or they've shoved a folding table at the front of the space to, you know, block the unwell from gaining entry. And
we all know how aesthetically pleasing folding tables are.
Oh, can't go wrong. Not to mention the plexiglass divider between you and the person in the, you know, polo shirt taking your order, whatever. It's every space is now effectively medicalized and cordoned off from the homo sacer, the unwell, you know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it destroys community in not only like the clinical fashion, but also there's this weird aura of suspicion just generally, right? Like, you just suspect the worst of other people. People are, you know, we've shifted to becoming hypochondriacs, while ignoring things which are objectively larger problems. It's very, very strange state of affairs. I don't know if you have anything more to say on that subject, but I did notice the in the book the Nick Land quote specifically. I know there's a certain like kind of circle where he's very popular, but I was just wondering what the reason for the inclusion of that quote specifically was.
Yeah, I mean, I've read Nick Land, CCRU, etc. I included Nick Land there alongside Jose Canseco, and the interplay there is a distant nod to like Twitter Spaces and the sort of intellectual breadth that exists on that site. I wanted two people very different, a very different kind of intellectual strata or spaces, essentially kind of pointing to the fact that we are in some form of decline.
Mhm. Mhm.
Two very disparate voices. So I figured Nick Land and Jose Canseco are pretty disparate.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the, at least I would say in the spaces we're in, that a lot of the sort of backlash against the general intellectual and, you know, physical and political like homogenization is to sort of collide things which don't fit together in a way.
Yeah.
Because it sort of discombobulates the system or anyone who might have a sort of pre-programmed set of responses to things, and like makes them either not, that makes it incomprehensible in sort of a Deleuzian fashion, or, you know, like, you know, signals to them that this isn't for you, sort of thing. I think that might have been what was so confusing about Trump, you know, because in a way he was sort of a clown in many ways, but, you know, all of a sudden, against all odds, he became leader of the free world. And I think that was, you know, despite what people say about, you know, the actual reasons why they were, you know, terrified of his totalitarianism or whatever, I think the actual reason was because he didn't fit in a box.
Yeah, I think that's really accurate. Was having a conversation with someone the other night who I hadn't seen in a while, and maybe to be provocative to this person, I was like, I think, you know, Biden is a worse president than Donald Trump was, and the guy was like absolutely shocked that I would say that. You know, jokingly, I was like, Trump was awake, so that's a bonus. But in addition to that, I'm not singing Trump's praises as much as I am, not, at least not in a direct way, really, as much as I am illustrating that he was such a shock to the system and such a break with what people saw as this generative, positive, presidential decorum. And to strip that away illustrates in a scary way, it illustrates a certain kind of decline, but in a sort of positive way, it illustrates just what that office might really be, what it might really entail. And on the whole, I find that to be positive and generative. You know, it's an emperor has no clothes type moment, or it's a signal that our great belief in decorum and sort of carrying yourself a certain way is just a mask for something else, and that mask was stripped.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find the use of language really, especially in the sort of corporate media, the use of presidential, unpresidential, and we have it over here to extent with prime ministerial and unprime ministerial. It doesn't really mean what you think the word might mean. I think it is a way of signaling approval or disapproval without I don't know what to say, giving up your objectivity, right?
Yes.
Or supposed
Yes.
objectivity.
Right.
Yeah, it's weird because you kind of have to look through the signaling now, because it's weird because you can tell when someone's being ideological, because, you know, I can say a good thing about Trump and Biden. I can say at least one good thing about them. I can say at least one good thing about, you know, our prime minister and the leader of the opposition over here. I think that's because, you know, it's not because I don't have, you know, a preference towards one side. It's because, you know, I'm actually trying to think about what might be best for the country, or, you know, something like that. But, you know, when you raise that and someone explodes because how could you possibly have something good to say about the Conservatives or have something good to say about Trump, like, they won't even cross that like intellectual boundary line.
No, and what's really difficult is the next step of that conversation, where you have a choice. You can say, okay, this person is not going to meet me in the intellectual, on the intellectual ground that I need them to, so I can stop. And that's a failure of the kind of community we talk about. Like, That's a failure of trying to generate further ideas. Or what happens is you try to, folks can like try to like facts and logic like people into an idea and try to dig them out of the sand of an ideology. But my brief history with attempting to do this shows that that does not really work either. So ideology is extremely totalizing now, and it's very difficult to have metered conversations that are attempting to go somewhere. As frustrating as they are, that's what we were speaking on earlier. That's what we should be doing. That's how we get out of here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I don't know, at least personally, when someone unreasonably explodes in one direction, I'm, I kind of switch off, like, because I don't,
Yeah.
I see it as kind of a lost cause, because part of me wants to hope that, well, we'll switch off for a bit and then, something will happen to change this person's mind. But I think ultimately, even if someone's making a bad decision, you need to people need to have the freedom to make the wrong decision, I think.
No doubt. I mean, that's the other kind of like elephant in the room with the kind of political spaces we're describing, is that you almost aren't allowed an interiority any longer. So if someone has an opposing interiority to me, you're right. Maybe it's generative or helpful for me to just allow them to at least have it, because the systems that we're describing don't even want you to have that interiority. They don't want you to have the inner voice.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a difference between religion and politics?
Well, there's a twofold answer. One, absolutely, yes. But two, kind of in practice on the material plane right now, I think a lot of people practice politics as religion. I mean, when God is removed from the state in such a dramatic way that faith itself is seen as a negative, that impulse has to go somewhere. And there are larger than life figures battling it out on a global stage. Very easy for us to replace them as gods. Mm-hmm. So on a material level, I can see how it's practiced that way, but I think there is absolutely an intrinsic difference.
Oh God, I've just got this awful image in my head of our current crop of politicians in a Iliad type.
Sure, in the Pantheon.
Epic poem. I think that'd be quite a good parody. You're right, like a parody of the Iliad, but it's like,
Yeah, there's something there. Yeah.
So, because do you think it's a good thing that those lines are crossed between religion and politics, or do you think it's just because people are so devoid of a traditional religion that it just naturally went into place?
Yeah, I think it's a natural extension of a dearth of tradition and a removal of ritual from our lives. As I age, I'm really attracted to ritual. I'm really attracted to the marking of time through enjoying things with people. Again, that goes back to community. Like it's almost the only logical way out in a time when we're so hyper atomized and kept from one another through various like mediated forms. I have a huge soft spot and place in my life for ritual at the moment.
It's interesting because I mean, it's obviously the cliche, people, get a bit older and they become born again or whatever, right? Like,
yeah.
I mean, you can, we can call it ritual or whatever. I don't know what level we're talking about here, but it's interesting how when people age, they tend to go in that direction. Do you have an opinion as to why that might be?
Well, I think it's the separation from politics. Like when you were asking, like, is politics? Because I was raised very like kind of like left humanist. My mother was like a kind of a seeker. She was all over the place with religion, and my father was really just kind of like staunch atheist. And so growing up in that, I was kind of somewhere in the middle, like agnostic, it's not really my business kind of thing. But that led to me thinking like a humanist, and thinking of like but once I divorced myself from these like political machines that were tied to my professional aims, I realized, I think, that I was putting stock in politics as uh, a sort of stopgap measure against thinking of larger questions. So I can only speak for myself, but that's and I'm not saying I'm necessarily religious or have religion or have found God or anything. I'm just way more open to tradition, ritual, etc., and thinking of larger things because I'm no longer concerned with these like quotidian terrestrial political matters.
Mm. So that really is that's a pretty hard distinction for you, right? That the politics is very terrestrial and the religious stuff is beyond that.
Yeah, I mean that's why I cast a sort of an alien robot in the lead role of this book, because I tried to think of the most extra, terrestrial sort of supra Earth perspective I could take, so that it would not be imbued with easily imbued with like a left-right dichotomy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's talk about that. So the sort of the guide for how do we get here is a I don't know what is he a robot? Is he got some biological parts of him? I don't know.
I
How
mean,
old is this new book?
there's like a Rosetta Stone, the very last inner cover, if read closely, is actually my conception of exactly what it is and where it comes from. But it's not obvious. It's I don't want to spoil it for anyone. He's essentially a robot. It's essentially an extraterrestrial robot for sake of conversation. But there's definitely more there if you go into that last page.
Okay, well, something to dig around in at least. So so the name Void. I mean, obviously, if you get into the postmodern thing, you're talking about death of God. There's a void that's left. Is there any other reason for that name, or is it just?
Well, that was the main reason. There is also a reveal toward the end of the book that he is more than just this simple machine. Perhaps that machine has a sort of nefarious function, and if that function is played out, we will be nothing but a void.
Right.
So there's the main reason is death of God, sure, but it actually does end up playing out in the story.
Hmm. And do you think that the void character will come back in some form, or is there? I don't know if this lends itself to a sequel or whether we'd like to see the sequel or not. But
well, I mean, I've discussed a sequel. I'm not sure. What's interesting is this book was written in 2019, so the world has gone through, a rather massive change, and kind of things we've been alluding to previous. What's really been eye-opening to me is how it reads now, given the fact that I wrote it almost 3 years ago now. It is still pertinent, and it also reads like a guidepost to the sort of more recent societal changes that we've seen. So in that, if I wrote a sequel, it would almost be about bridging those two worlds. Though I think, just having read it again this morning in preparation for our talk, I think it still plays.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it captures the. I mean, specific beats. I can kind of see now how it is kind of like those kind of like three years hence, just because of the specific beats. But I feel like the general intent holds true for basically the whole of the late 2010s and kind of where we've ended up now. I don't think I think the themes are still relevant and still there. When did you kind of know that illustration was going to be what you did with your life? Like, I mean, everyone kind of starts at a different age, but when did you, I mean, did it start in school? Were you, just ignoring the teacher and doodling all the time, or
Absolutely.
when did this start?
Yeah, absolutely. I was definitely the kid on the first day of school who angled for like not quite the seat in the far back of the room, because then you have eyes on you. You sit 2 seats in front of that kid. No one's looking at you. Can draw all day.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. First day of school, it's always what I did. Kind of to the right of the class, 2 seats up from the far back every time.
Right.
Yeah, always drawing. When I got into comic books at 11 or 12, like I said, would trace and draw and try to learn the craft of comics. After that, I was an avid skateboarder from about 14 years old to around 23. And, that entire world is built on t-shirt graphics, skateboard graphics. There's an entire cultural milieu surrounding the illustrated imagery that skateboarding, thrives on. So in that time, my focus shifted to wanting to draw skateboard graphics. In my 20s, I finally got an opportunity to do that. I worked for several skateboard companies and skateboard apparel companies and snowboard apparel companies. And through just my building of a canon of artwork there, that translated more into the world of music and culture. And those, the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours or whatever was well entrenched by the time I was about 14. So I could work in a number of illustrative styles, and it's supported me, ups and downs. I'm not a rich man, but 40, still alive, still got most of my teeth, thanks to drawing pictures.
Mm-hmm. Was your work ever bad? Like, do you ever look back on like a phase of your work and you're like, oh God?
Yeah, I mean, I'll make something bad next week. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Yeah, totally. There was, I won't say it was bad because it's just a learning curve, but it wasn't great. There was a period of time in my teens where I would just like ape certain illustrators' styles and thinking that like I had really mastered their sort of aesthetic. That was pretty cringy because, I was just a teenager and I was probably doing it at like 60% proficiency or whatever. But like, I thought I nailed it.
So you've gotten into this different medium now. Are we to expect sort of a longer sort of graphic novel, or are we gonna get more along the lines of How Did We Get Here next?
Well, I actually published a short in Aeonic Comics issue 2, which came out in either May or June of last year. And that's very short. That's just a humorous sci-fi short, about 7-8 pages long. So that's out. I have a few shorts I put up on my Instagram or whatever, just like 4 or 5 slide things. Little bits here and there. I'll post illustrations occasionally for like mixtapes that I make or whatever. But that's just, those are all fun little pieces. I am currently working on my second book, which is slated to be about 100 pages, so graphic novel length. Without giving too much away, it's about a very prominent pop culture figure of the last 20, 25 years who I am positing with some real world good word is an intelligence asset.
Okay, right.
That's about all I can say about it, but it'll be a graphic novel. I'm talking to a couple publishers about it. We'll see. It's still in the making. I'm still in the writing process and character development process. I've been on it for about a year. I imagine it'll take maybe a year to illustrate, just given my schedule. But let's say hopefully by the end of 22, we'll have at least a teaser out for it.
Great. Well, sounds like we got some interesting stuff on the way. I think I'll have the link for How Did We Get Here in the description, along with your Twitter, Instagram. Is there anything else you want to plug?
No, that's it. Appreciate you having me on. It's great chat.
Yeah, it was a good talk. I honestly thought that more of these were going to be, philosophical when I started, but I'm actually really enjoying the aesthetics conversations, to be honest with you. So it's been great to speak to
Yeah.
you.
I mean, it's really funny. Like, you try to like gear up for like a podcast appearance or like a video appearance. You're like, I'm gonna have to, really bring the A game. But the best conversations end up being more along the lines of what we just had, where it's what is going on?
Right.
Discussing what is going on.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm sort of trying to develop my technique, but I found that just have a few threads, and if you pull on them, you find stuff more interesting than you could have planned ahead to do anyway.
Totally.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Some of these conversations get a little bit too serious, so I have sort of a tongue-in-cheek question I usually finish off with. So if you were on death row, what would your last meal be?
Well, I am a big fan of food and have considered death row many times, so I think I might have an answer. I would have an inch thick aged steak, maybe porterhouse. I would have uh, Romanesco soup with garlic and cipollini onion. I would have a pint of Miller High Life beer, which I'm sure they wouldn't allow, but all things being equal, that'd be about it. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Sterling.
Thank you so much.